And thank you for taking time to join us on today's webinar. Today we're going to be speaking about the latest USCIS EB-5 visa I-526 E statistics, breaking down rural and non-rural or urban filings by country through the present Q3 fiscal year 2025. So from April 2022, the start of the RIA, through June 2025, which is the latest information just released by USCIS a few days ago. All right, so here's a little overview of what we're going to cover during today's webinar. We'll talk about a little bit first about EB-5AN and the EB-5 program generally. We'll look at the data for rural versus non-rural I-526Es by country. We'll dig into some high-level conclusions and predictions that we put together based on the available data. Some guidance on what investors can do now who are seriously considering EB-5. We'll talk about some advantages for rural projects, and then we'll spend a few minutes at the end talking about some of our currently open and approved rural and urban TEA projects as well. So a little bit about EB-5AN. We're a leading EB-5 investment fund manager. We've worked with thousands of investors from around the world from more than 70 different countries. We have 10 regional centers that cover 48 of the 50 United States. And one of the things that makes us unique in the space is a commitment to investment transparency. We strive to provide all of the documents related to a 956F project application along with financial statements where available for current projects that we have open. And we also have a very active blog and YouTube channel with hundreds of articles about best practices for due diligence for EB-5 visa real estate investment projects. As I mentioned earlier, I'm Sam Silverman, one of the two managing partners of EB-5AN, and joined on this webinar with my partner Mike Schoenfeld. And I'll let Mike jump in and share a little bit about his background and experience and kind of the genesis for starting our company more than 10 years ago.
Perfect. Thanks, Sam, and thanks everybody for joining. We finally got some data out of USCIS. We've been waiting a while to be able to see this, so it's exciting. As you can see, so I'm Mike Schoenfeld, one of the founding partners of EB-5AN. Both Sam and I come from more of the institutional side of the world, working at BCG, and then I was in private equity after. And what we've done over the past over a decade now is try and build an EB-5 company focused on transparency and just providing high quality deals that make sense for EB-5 investors. And that's helped lead us to being one of the largest regional center operators in the space.
All right, and on today's webinar, we also have with us Ahmed Khan, Senior Vice President with our team, who has extensive experience in the EB-5 space as both an immigration attorney at some of the most respected immigration law firms in the country, as well as regional center experience as well. So I'll let Ahmed jump in and introduce himself, and then we'll get into some of the data.
Yeah, thanks, Sam. And as Sam mentioned, my name is Ahmed. I am Senior VP here at EB-5AN. I've been with the company for over 3 years now. And yeah, just we're going to dig in pretty deep today to some of the stuff that we've seen from USCIS. And yeah, the clock is starting to tick a little bit on the EB-5 program. And we've done incredibly well over the last few years at informing investors and helping them make great decisions for their EB-5 journey. And I think just, yeah, we're kind of in crunch time now before grandfathering ends, and this data comes at a timely time for investors to make a good decision.
All right, thanks, Ahmed. As I mentioned earlier, we're one of the few regional center operators that have regional centers that cover the entire continental United States, which means we can select and seek out the most favorable rural and urban projects around the country without being restricted geographically to one or two particular regions. And we've worked with investors from around the world from more than 70 countries at this point. We've been featured in many of the leading publications. Here's a list of a couple of them. And all right, so let's jump into the data. So Ahmed, do you want to start kind of laying out some of the recent quarter statistics and kind of how the most recent data from the last quarter kind of fits in with some of the overall trends that we've seen over the last almost 3 years at this point, over 3 years, post RAA.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that we're now kind of, like I said, we're kind of at the home stretch, if you will, of the RIA. We've got 3 years now of data to kind of go off of and understand what the trends are in the market. And you can see very clearly that when people first started filing in EB-5 after the RIA, there was a proclivity for high unemployment area projects, or what we call urban projects. There's a lot of different factors. We've talked about them extensively, everything from availability of projects, carryover projects from pre-RIA era, all the way to just the myth that, okay, investing in a high unemployment or urban area is going to lead to a greater success of getting my money back. Over time, a lot of those myths and kind of I guess things that have been peddled around the industry have turned around, and then we've kind of helped to show that there's a real advantage to choosing rural projects as well. It's good to have both. There's definitely different investors who want different things, but certainly I think the biggest change that we've seen over the last year and a half or so is just the speed at which USCIS has started adjudicating rural applications. Lately we've been seeing approvals in as little as 4 months, and every investor that's doing EB-5 is typically choosing this route for their green card. The primary purpose of doing an EB-5 investment is the green card. And if you're getting approvals in just a few months and you're getting green cards in under a year through EB-5, then that's money well spent in a lot of people's eyes. So we've seen a pretty big shift over the last year of people who are now preferring, and we'll talk about this even more on the next slide when we're looking at the breakdown by country, but people are starting to prefer rural applications over high unemployment urban applications. But even with that being said, you can see that there is still a pretty high demand still for high unemployment area projects. So it's not that I've heard a lot of narrative of, oh, you can see that, rural is just completely dominating the space. Everyone's filing in rural. But if you're looking at, the last several months, a third of the market is still choosing to go with high unemployment urban projects. And we've kind of always had this mantra here at EB-5AN of, there's the right project for everyone, but it may not necessarily be what everyone else is doing, right? So if you are someone who's looking for maybe a balance of different things, and a high unemployment urban project does offer that to you, that's still an option for a lot of investors. So a lot of investors are choosing immigration as their priority. We're seeing that in the form of higher numbers of rural applications being filed, but there's still a non-zero number of folks still choosing the urban category as well. Other than that, I think it's pretty clear to see that demand has just grown steadily over the last couple of years. So I'm sure Mike can talk about that a little bit, especially with the Trump gold card announcement. And I think what was even more kind of momentous over the last several months was all the different changes that he brought about for H-1B and things like that. Even though that we don't actually think they're going to be affected, as we said in our last webinar, but just the uncertainty that the climate that we're in right now with immigration is pushing a lot of people to jump off the fence and take the plunge.
Exactly. And so if you look at this chart, it's pretty clear everything is moving slowly up and to the right. Just overall filings in rural has gained in popularity, but what you'll see is it is also catalyst driven, where something happens and it pushes a lot of people to invest at one point in time. So the first one was really that fee increase in April of last year is when it increased, and that pulled a ton of demand forward. So if you look right after that, for the April, May, June, July, it seems like demand actually went back down. But really, if you blend out that 1 month across, everything is just pretty consistently slowly marching up and to the right in terms of demand. And then again, the same exact thing happened with that Trump gold card announcement in February, where March was crazy, pulled forward a lot of demand, in April as well, and then it tapered off. And we saw it continue to taper off even past this data. And then, of course, the most recent announcement came out of the implementation of the $1 million gold card and the H-1B fee increase. And now we're seeing another big catalyst of where investors are choosing to move forward, that we're ready to go, but this is the final push. And I have to believe that that's going to kind of cause this next wave of demand. And it's impossible to know the exact future, but with approvals coming in 6 to 9 months on average, with many of them in 4 months, I think we're starting to see now kind of the word of mouth effect, where for a lot of those investors, where at the start of the RIA, nobody really knew how well EB-5 would work, because we were all from the industry before, when it would take 3, 4, 5, 6 years to even get an approval, let alone a green card for those investors from high demand countries. All of a sudden, we're seeing this work with hundreds of investors getting green cards in under a year, very quickly. And especially in the rural category, which is part of the growth, is I think it's just word of mouth of people realizing, okay, my friend got this approval in 6 months, like I can do it too, and it's not going to take me years. So I tend to believe that's going to keep going. And unfortunately, that does mean that a lot of visas will be used, and we'll go through the data of what this could mean in terms of potential backlogs. But it is an interesting chart to look at.
And Ahmed, earlier you mentioned the grandfathering clause. What is that, and how do you see that, having an impact, in the next 12 months leading up to that September 30th, 2026 event?
Yeah, so when that's a great question, Sam. So when we talk about grandfathering, what we're referring to is a specific section of the RIA. So if you're unfamiliar with the RIA in general, it's the Reform and Integrity Act that was passed in I believe March of 2022. That basically reauthorized the EB-5 program for a period of 5 years up until September of 2027. At the same time, one of the big concerns, and so it's the Reform and Integrity Act, in it by itself, its name tells you what the purpose was. It was to kind of fix a lot of the problems that were going on in EB-5. And one of those problems were in the past, when the program sunset or was basically reached its climax, there wasn't protection for investors who had already filed. And so what that meant was, if you had already filed and then the program basically sunset or ceased to exist, your application could now be in limbo and not processed. And so what Congress did was they included a protection that said, okay, if you file by a certain date, no matter what happens in the future, your application will be processed and it won't be affected by any future changes in the program. Now, that all makes sense, and it's a great protection for investors. It's fantastic. But what doesn't make sense is that for whatever reason, when it was written into the statute, although the program itself is extended until September 2027, the grandfathering or the protection was only afforded until September 30th, 2026. So we are officially into the last 12 months of when grandfathering applies. Investors who are filing until September 30th, 2026 can kind of rest assured that their application, regardless of what happens to EB-5 in the future, will always be adjudicated under the rules that they have filed under, which are the rules of today. Anything beyond September 30th, 2026 up until September 30th, 2027, technically would still follow the rules that we have, but there's no protection that if the program were then to sunset, that those investors' applications would continue to be processed. So it's a pretty tenuous kind of position to be in as an EB-5 investor when you're putting that much money on the line. From a regulatory standpoint, we've got some notion, and a lot of folks in the industry have been clamoring to get that grandfathering clause extended through 2027, but there isn't anything concrete yet, and we haven't seen any real progress on that front just yet. So as of right now, the date that investors should keep in mind that they should be applying by is September 2026.
Got it. All right, great. Let's spend a few minutes, and Ahmed, tell us about the breakdown by country, rural, urban applications, and what do these trends mean, and why is there a difference between China, India, and rest of world in terms of project preference?
Yeah, and it's clear to see that if you look at past iterations of this, when we have previous data, it's really just extrapolated from there. I think there's a few new surprises. Definitely the rest of world starting to pick up rural, and Vietnam, South Korea, and Taiwan as well, starting to pick up rural at a much faster clip than before. That's what's kind of surprising. India as well, the rural has finally surpassed the urban as the majority stake in terms of who's applying where. But what we're seeing here is just a breakdown of what applicants are preferring. And India and China to me are fascinating because, when you look at which category has more visas available, it's always been rural, and yet somehow urban has continuously outpaced it until very recently in terms of applications coming from those two countries. Now, over the last year or so, we've definitely seen both China and Indian investors, Chinese and Indian investors, start to prefer rural applications, and that's why those numbers have now superseded the urban applications as the majority stake in those respective countries. The reason for that very clearly has just become two things. One, priority processing, two, greater visa numbers, which should lead to a shorter backlog. And the logic here is pretty clear, right? If you're not even in line for a green card, there's no way for you to kind of avoid a long backlog. And so what investors are finding out is that it's taking 2 years or maybe even longer to get their 526E approved in a high unemployment urban project. Whereas in rural, their friends who are investing in rural projects are getting approved in like 6, 7, 8 months. I think 80% of our investors who have invested in rural, and probably a larger number over the last 2 years, have been approved in under a year. So pretty much across the board, we're seeing investors being approved in a number of months, whereas a lot of our urban and high unemployment area investors are taking much, much longer, sometimes even more than 2 years. And so they're getting into line quicker. They're giving themselves a chance at basically just getting their green card and being done with the at least the first step of the immigration process for an EB-5 application before a backlog appears on the visa bulletin. And then the second thing is, okay, once those numbers do start, kind of adding up, we start getting a lot more approvals. Country caps are hit first, and then you basically have a second bite at the apple in the set asides. It's a nice way to think about this is like, okay, India and China each have their 7% protection. Once they've been capped out and used up all their visas that are afforded to them individually as countries in the EB-5 category, if there's more visas available in one of the set-asides, they're going to be able to continue to get one of those visas. It's almost very similar to the H-1B lottery, where you have one shot if you're just a bachelor's degree holder, but if you are a master's degree holder, you actually go twice. You get a second shot or second bite at the apple. So a very similar concept here. And then if we look at just rest of world, Vietnam, South Korea, Taiwan, and then every other country involved, I think what everyone is just kind of seeing is, wow, we are just getting approved much, much faster on the rural side. Rural projects are just leading to immigration results at a much faster clip. And I've traveled a lot over the last couple of years to various places, Latin America, East Asia, Middle East, even to Canada. And there's a lot of investors who are okay with some of the, what I would call, I guess, cons of rural applications, which, you look for good rural projects, they do tend to be a little bit longer, but guess what? They're getting you your green card faster, which is the whole reason why you're doing it. And so they're okay with a slightly higher opportunity cost of keeping their capital invested for longer if it means that they can get their green card and be through the immigration side of things a lot sooner, especially for those investors who are applying from abroad and trying to go through a consular processing versus adjustment of status. So yeah, lots to love and lots to extrapolate from this. Mike, I think you can talk about it more.
Yeah, and one of the things that I think is a little bit surprising still is, so you see India and China have pretty much balanced out now with the rural and urban, now even with rural being higher, but that Taiwan, South Korea, and Vietnam, I think part of the reason for that, it's kind of twofold. One is that these are agent-driven markets where they've preferred those high unemployment deals to sell, when the rest of the world, which is not agent-driven, even though those are countries that are not actually high demand compared to Taiwan, South Korea, and Vietnam, which could find themselves in a backlog, have still chosen rural at significantly higher, kind of a higher amount than those other three agent-driven markets. So I actually think that's something pretty interesting to look at. And of course, there's also just investor preference. Maybe they prefer cities like New York and Miami in some countries. But overall, just at the left side of the screen where you can see, we are now about balanced at this part in the RIA, where it's about 1-to-1 urban to rural. Now, of course, there's 2-to-1 set-aside visas. But as Ahmed mentioned, everybody kind of eats first. So those investors that came in earlier in the RIA, so let's say that first year to year and a half, even if they were from India or China, they're probably in pretty good shape in terms of being in the high unemployment category, because there wasn't that high of a volume. But now as you're getting to the point where there are kind of thousands of applications ahead of you, even from your specific country, the set-asides are even more important than they were a year or two ago, and the speed is showing as well for processing.
Yeah,
All right.
absolutely.
All right, let's dig in a little bit to what pending applications look like and talk a little bit about kind of what a potential future backlog could look like and what factors are going to go into determining how long that could be for new investors filing in urban and rural today. Ahmed, do you want to kind of walk us through the chart on the left side to start with?
Yeah, absolutely. So I know this is a lot of information on your screens right now. So let's kind of walk through it piece by piece and understand exactly what we're dealing with. First, on the far left, we've kind of seen a breakdown per country, and you can see that China still dominates the EB-5 category. This has always been the case since kind of the category's inception, and so it continues today. China just dominates. I think the advent of rest of world filings is really what's kind of concerning for everyone else involved, both India and China, because the more of those applications that are filed, the more they're taking away from visa numbers that might normally be allotted to India and China historically, right? So that is something to keep in mind. And yeah, we've just never seen 28% filings from rest of world. That this is a very new thing over the last few years. And yeah, I think it's shown that the program has grown, and there's definitely more marketability for it across the globe, but definitely just as surprising to see. Now, let's step away from the country's specific numbers and just look at overall numbers of visas, or sorry, applications that are pending. And I think that's the important thing about the second column, is that there are 12,986 total applications that have been filed since the RIA was instituted. And what we're seeing here is that for all of the catch up that rural has done over the last several months, there's still a majority of high unemployment urban filings. Now, this data doesn't include the last 3 months. I have a feeling that it's going to be closer to like kind of 50-50 at that point, but it just goes to show just how much urban was outpacing rural when this program when the RA first came into effect. And when you have these total number of applications pending, that doesn't account for all of the family members. One of the big differences from EB-5 versus like H-1B is that it's not a one-to-one ratio where one visa number is given to the entire family of an approved H-1B application. Instead, each individual family member does take a separate visa number away from the overall pool. And so what we've done here is just assume a very conservative 2 investors per application. Historically, these numbers are closer to about 2.6 to 2.7. So it's actually a little bit worse than this, but we're just looking at this very conservatively and saying, okay, even with just 2 people per application, you're looking at a pending number of over 12,000 folks in each category. Now, this is really concerning for a number of reasons, but I'm going to talk about why it's maybe not as bad for some folks as it is for others. But really what this leads us to is you've got 12,000 plus visas that need to be issued since the beginning of the RIA era. And yeah, there's only 2,000 in rural and 1,000 in urban. With rollover, you can kind of assume almost double the first year that we hit the limit, but it gets less and less every year. And so it could take several years to get through these numbers. Now, here's where I think a lot of the industry is kind of just looking at total numbers and completely forgetting that country caps also serve to protect. And I think that this is just a product of us, if you're talking to a lot of Indian investors or Chinese investors, they're so used to being screwed over by the country caps in the EB2 and EB3 categories that they haven't realized yet that actually country caps were initially instituted to protect some countries. And when you're not the majority filing country in a category, you actually get a little bit of protection versus kind of it's screwing you over. And so bad news for China, they are the majority. And so they're the ones whose visas kind of get taken away more and more as other countries file. But what I really want to highlight here is India, right? 2,804 total applications since the beginning of the RIA. And I think that, we've certainly got close to 700 approvals since that time. I know that I've seen some other regional centers that have posted similar numbers. I assume that a lot of the industry is seeing a lot of those approvals. And I'm assuming that, again, at least 20% of those approvals are coming from Indian applicants. And so what that really means then is that there's less, I'm going to wager a guess that there's less than about 2,500 pending applications for Indians specifically. And then you multiply that number by 2 and you get 5,000 total applications for India that have to be issued, 5,000, sorry, visas or green cards that have to be issued, okay? Now, when we look at total visas allotted in the EB-5 category, remember, you hit your country cap first. And so if you just look at 10,000 visas, you're going to be looking at 700 visas per country, right? 10,000 total in the EB-5 category, 700 per country. But it's actually a little bit better than that because of rollovers, because of trickle down. You do get closer to about 16 to 18,000 per year that are actually available in the EB-5 category. And guess what? India and China and all the other countries each get 7% protection from that number. And so it's not really like 700 per year. It's closer to about 1,000 per year that each country is getting. And so if you've got 5,000 folks or maybe even 6,000 folks who are waiting for their green cards from India, well, guess what? Your maximum kind of backlog starts to look a lot closer to like 5 or 6 years in the worst case scenario than some of the other crazy numbers I've seen out there of like 12 or 15 years. So it's really important to understand this red text right here is really what I want to point out to people. We're doing easy math here. We're kind of making a lot of assumptions here to showcase this data and help people understand that, look, a backlog is coming. And it's very difficult to understand how long that backlog is going to be. But it's really important to understand that there's so many different factors that go into calculating just how long a backlog is going to take before you're able to get your green card. And it's really important to understand all those individual factors and how they play against with one another. So I'm just seeing a lot of information out there. I think no one is in the, la la land that there's no backlog or we're not going to see a backlog or that it's going to be just a very short 1-year backlog. I think we're all kind of on the side of, yes, a backlog is coming. It's going to be multiple years, most likely for both of these categories. But I do think it's important to understand exactly what variables are going to apply to each kind of individual country and each individual situation that investors are going through.
Yep, and what I'd say is to kind of double down on that, the left side of this chart is the only thing that we really know. That about the 12,986 applications, like that is absolutely known. We can make a pretty good estimate based on historical of how many visas would be required, but what we're missing here is since the start of the RIA is we don't know how many of these visas have been issued. Now through 2024, we know there weren't that many, but I can tell you that tons of investors are getting visas issued. Now they're getting their actual green cards, both at the consulate and through the 485. So we're seeing tons of green cards now, which are chipping away at that number of however many pending visas there are. And we just got a new year. So whatever those were chipping away at kind of went out of last year. So we've got that fresh batch. And as Ahmed was saying, I think that the group that unfortunately is in the worst position is China, because there are so many pre-RIA pending green cards to be issued that they really are only, the set-asides are the only saving grace for China. All the rest, there's still a very long line of people waiting. So for China, it is kind of, it could be a dire situation, and it's definitely a lot worse. But for somewhere like India, even with the high usage, as we were going through the math, because the unreserved visas are able to be used and you have all those other factors, it doesn't look that bad, even for high unemployment, because it depends a lot more on how early you filed. For the high unemployment people that filed a year and a half ago, they might actually be just fine because there's enough unreserved pretty quickly to get there. But what I would say is that the further we get into the post-RIA era and the more that each country does need to rely on those set-aside visas, the more important it is to be in the one that has double the allotment rural compared to high unemployment if usage has been or filings have been about the same for each of those categories in total. So yeah, the main takeaway is like, yeah, nobody can tell you exactly how long it's going to be. We can't even tell you exactly when it's going to show up in the visa bulletin or if it'll show up anytime soon, because we don't know how fast they're issuing the green cards and if there is a clear path to using all the visas in a year. So I think everybody is on their toes a little bit waiting for the visa bulletin, where it's possible it shows up very soon. It's possible it doesn't show for a year because they can't actually issue enough of these green cards. So that's kind of one thing. But then on the back end, people have been saying, oh, there's a multi-year backlog in rural. They were saying that last year, and yet we've had dozens of investors from the last like 6 months that filed getting their approvals and green cards in hand. So it's just one of those things where it's really a moving target. It's helpful to look at all the data as a whole, and that's what we're trying to do here is you can see the data, you can see all the moving pieces and make an educated decision on understanding what's most important, how long you think the wait might be, how do you handicap that versus what your investment objectives are, and make the right decision for yourself.
Thanks, Mike. And I think on the next slide, this gives a little more kind of high level data just to give a sense about I-526E approval volume and filings. And what's interesting here is on the left side, we see kind of total receipts. But for fiscal year 2025, this is only through Q3. So with only 3 quarters compared to all 4 in fiscal year 2024, there's already about 30-ish% more in just the first 3 quarters. So substantial increase in new filings has happened in the last 12 months. And so we think that large spike is really what's going to kind of drive a future backlog potentially showing up on the visa bulletin sooner than later. As green cards start to get issued for those applications in the next 12 months, that's when we could face a situation where total approvals and people adjusting status, getting the green card in their hand, just overwhelms the amount of visas currently available within a given period of time. And I'll let Ahmed kind of jump in and just kind of share his thoughts mechanically on why that is likely to happen in the next 12 months.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think your main points are absolutely correct, Sam. And we did a webinar a few months ago where we kind of looked at the 2 competing ideas that the visa bulletin just wasn't being updated because not enough people were getting approved and receiving their green cards, and we just weren't seeing that shift in numbers enough for the Department of State to then issue a backlog. They issued a warning in January of this year, and then they kind of just let it all slide, and we've stayed current since then. I think that party might be coming to an end. I mean, we were seeing a concerted effort from USCIS here. We thought fiscal year 2024 was pretty good, but fiscal year 2025 was incredible in terms of USCIS getting through applications and approving them very, very quickly. I know that I was telling investors that it would take their application somewhere between 6 to 9 months in the rural category to be approved, and they saw their approvals in as little as 3 to 4. So it's been very good in some senses because people are getting approved very quickly. They're having that peace of mind that their green card is now on the way. But what it's going to lead to very soon, I would think, is that Department of State's going to realize, okay, there's a ton of people who are now approved in line for their green cards. They're going to start doing the math on a per country basis and realize there's enough pending demand with people already with approvals in hand that they should issue a backlog. And a backlog is really just a way for them to limit the amount of people who can appear and get a green card in that fiscal year. So yeah, I think it's coming. What's a little bit concerning is we're only going to get maybe 1 or 2 months of warning when it does happen, if that. And so there's just no time like the present. I think we've been saying it for a long time over the last 2 or 3 years. The earlier you get in, you're when a backlog. Let's talk about what happens when a backlog does hit, right? One thing is for sure: if your country is backlogged, let's just say across 1 or 2 of the 2 set-asides, you're going to be behind everyone else in line, right? It purely goes to priority date at that point. And so it's really important to get an earlier priority date, even if you do end up in a backlog down the road, because yeah, you're going to have a chance at basically beating out all the people who are behind you, even though you're behind all the people that are ahead of you. And I think the second thing that we'll probably talk about on the next slide, well, actually, we'll talk about that in a bit. But yeah, the approval rate also, I think, has been kind of surprising. I think part of this is administration kind of, it's an indicator of the administration's view on this visa type and how adjudicators have been looking at EB-5 applications. So under the Biden administration, we saw a lot of things sliding that now are being looked at under a microscope and to some extent even being denied. Everything from regional center provided loans to partial fundings. I mean, we've seen a lot of issues that, maybe the previous administration just kind of turned a blind eye to. And now the new administration is focusing USCIS's efforts to kind of look at these things with more scrutiny. And we're starting to see a lot more denials. So that the 94% approval rate it seems, still like a very high approval rate, but 6% denials in EB-5 is pretty unheard of typically. You don't see that many denials in EB-5 because of it's just a very small industry, and the attorneys that have been in this space have been doing it for a long time. So as long as you're working with an experienced attorney and an experienced regional center, it's pretty rare to see denials. So that was a kind of a surprising number.
All right, so let's shift gears. We talked a little bit about some of these predictions, but let's kind of just simplify these and hit a couple of the major ones for investors who are considering doing EB-5, in the next couple of months.
Yeah, so I think, there's a few key conclusions, and I'm just going to start by saying, look, if you want to do EB-5, there's a huge advantage, especially if you are inside the US. I mean, I think specifically if you are inside the US, to filing while the dates are still current. Getting an adjustment of status filed, it gives you status inside the United States. So even if you lose your F1 or your H1B or your L1 statuses, you still have a status that allows you to remain in the US. And in addition, the filing of an adjustment status also allows you to get a work permit and a travel permit. So this first bullet point right here that you're looking at that says, look, there's two specific countries. Obviously, we see the demand from both India and China. They are going to have a backlog at some point in the near future. It's really important for those investors, if you want to do EB-5, to get in before that backlog actually appears, because once it does, you're not going to be able to get your adjustment of status in concurrently, and you're not going to be able to get that EAD and advanced parole, the work and travel permit. So more than ever, there's a little bit of a ticking clock for Indian and Chinese investors to get in while they can, secure their status in the States, and then it could be a 3-year wait, it could be a 5-year wait, it could be a 7-year wait, as we just talked about. It might even be longer for some Chinese investors to get their conditional green cards. But the big advantage that everyone seems to have kind of gleaned over from when we first started with the AOS concurrent filings is that you get status and an EAD and an advanced parole. And for all intents and purposes, that's going to do away with a lot of the hardship that people are facing by having to go through the H-1B lottery every year, having to go through their employer for their visas, for their green card sponsorship, and especially when your company has layoffs, because then they're no longer able to sponsor you for a perm. NIWs are not being approved at the same rate that they were before, and neither are EB-1As, or EB-1Cs, or EB-1s in general. So it's become, in some ways, the only path to a green card within a decade, and there's a big difference between filing before the visa bulletin retrogresses and after. So I would say more now than ever, investors should be, if they're considering EB-5, now is the time to pull the trigger. The second point here, and again, we're gonna kind of preface this with, there's a lot of different variables here. We do think, or at least I think, that the rural category is going to see the visa backlog first. And that's probably because there's so many people being approved so quickly in the rural category, whereas HUA investors are still seeing much longer adjudication timelines for their 526E. But I also think that the rural TEA, because of the larger number of visas available in that category, those investors, especially Indian investors in those rural TEA projects, are going to be able to get through that line a lot faster. One, because they're going to get that priority processing, and just they might go through 2 fiscal years without a lot of HUA investors kind of challenging them for those same green cards. And two, because again, there are just more green cards available in the rural TEA. Same with the Chinese investors, it's a little bit of a different calculus because the country cap really does hurt. There's just too much competition at this point if you're a Chinese investor. But again, because there's more green cards available in the rural category, this is going to be I think a faster way to get through the backlog versus you saw kind of 2 slides ago, 3 slides ago, the same number of applications are pending in both categories. Well, one category has double the number of green cards. So no matter how you do the math, kind of the logic here would just speak that you're going to get through one line faster, the one that has the more green cards available in it. It definitely makes a difference if you're applying for overseas versus inside the US. We've seen a lot of consular delays from all parts of the world. No one's really safe from that. And then there's also different factors in terms of, when you can even apply, when you can lock your children's age, all these different things that kind of come up once you're already retrogressed and you're filing your application. And then the last thing here, yeah, approval rate still is above 90%. So even though we've seen a little bit more denials than previous, that we were used to seeing, the approval rates are extremely high still. All of our projects come with a 526E refund guarantee. So, you can feel safe knowing that if for some reason you are one of the few that are denied, your money will be returned to you in a timely manner. That's something that you should be asking every regional center that you're investing with, if that's something that they provide, and what are the stipulations for that guarantee? What do they have to do to make sure that they actually get the money back? And then, yeah, I think that this big number here at the bottom is really what everyone's keeping an eye on. It's just, there's just so many applications that are still pending adjudication. And, at some point, we're going to see those final action dates appear on the visa bulletin. And yeah, it's going to be a long line that everyone's going to have to get through. So let's see what happens over the next several years, but no time like the present to get in, lock in your place. And especially if you're Indian or Chinese and you're considering EB-5 versus like a 50-year EB-2 backlog, I think it's kind of an easy decision at that point.
All right, perfect. Thanks, Ahmed. All right, Mike, do you want to walk us through what are kind of next steps for investors who are considering EB-5 in the next couple of months?
Yeah, absolutely. And this is something whenever I'm speaking with an investor, I try to reinforce, which is the project, will not be the bottleneck in the process. It will be the source of funds and working with the immigration attorney to complete that source of funds. So what I always suggest is even before you pick out your project, you should focus on finding the immigration attorney you're going to work with and get them moving. Unfortunately, due to having many slow years in EB-5, there's a limited number of firms that specialize in EB-5, and with the demand going up and to the right, and especially after the Trump Gold Card announcement, a lot of the immigration attorneys are pretty busy right now. It's not like they're sitting around doing nothing. So I would strongly suggest start reaching out and engage that immigration attorney as quickly as possible to start on your source of funds once you've made the decision that EB-5 is the right fit. And the other reason I highlight that is because we've had many investors that kind of go through and choose a deal, and then they engage their attorney, and by the time they get done with source of funds in 2 months, 3 months, that deal sold out and it's not there anymore, and they have to start that whole process over of diligencing a project. And sometimes they're pretty upset that that project isn't available, and it happens all too often. So I'd say to me, just seeing big picture what's going on with the data, with the number of filings, with how fast approvals are coming. It's really just a matter of deciding, is EB-5 the solution for you and the family? And if so, don't hesitate. Hire an attorney. We're happy to provide introductions. You can find a lot online as well, and start working with them and organizing your documents so that you can then get to that stage of picking the project that's available at the time when you're ready to actually make the investment. So that to me is really the key here. Is we know there's a line coming. Approvals are coming fast. Visa bulletin's still current. Could be current for a month. Could be current all next year. We really don't know. But if you're committed, you should start now.
All right. All right, let's talk just for 1 minute. I think we can skip over rural advantages. We spent a little bit of time on that earlier. Mike, do you want to talk about some of the approval trends we're seeing and kind of what that translates to for new investors filing now?
Absolutely. And this is, I believe we're the only company that actually shares our data on this. Of all of the 526E approvals that we have, we publish. We want everyone to have clear and transparent information. And what I'd say is what you can see also is this line is down and to the right. Speed of approvals is absolutely coming down. Now, a vast majority of these approvals are for rural deals. The high unemployment deals that we've had, some of them have been approved organically, and that's going to be what you see in kind of the top left of the graph with the Saltaire project. And it just takes a little bit longer for those high unemployments. But recently, in the rural projects that we have, where you can see the people that filed, let's say, second half of 2024 onwards, tons and tons of approvals, where if you look at the amount of approvals in under a year, it's well over 75% on just this chart. But then when you actually look at it of the ones in the last like 2 years that have filed in that time frame, it's much more significant, where we can pretty confidently say that it's more than a 50% chance you're going to be approved in like that 6 to 9 month period or shorter. So it's really powerful to actually see the data, see how fast the approvals are coming. It's not a small sample size. So you're able to really get an idea of how fast these applications are getting processed.
And when we take a look at the 956Fs, the project applications, we see kind of a similar trend. More recent applications are all, pretty much in that 3 to 4 month window as well. So not quite as important, but also kind of the same trend on the project side.
Yeah, and on this side, I think it's important. So we've had 22 projects go through the 956F process and be approved. We've had 0 denials. So even though sometimes a project is available and not approved, doesn't mean that it won't be approved. It just means that it hasn't been long enough, and it can take up to 5 months. And one of the trends that we've seen is that investors tend to prefer a project that does have that 956F approval. So when there's a good project that isn't full yet and it gets the approval, it'll fill up very quickly after, which goes back to my point of it's really important to get the immigration attorney kicked off so that you're ready with your source of funds so that you can very quickly move on the right project for you if it's available, and especially if it's available and approved, so you're able to get into that before it closes.
Yeah, and on that note, Mike, I'd like to say that like a lot of investors I've been speaking with lately, they've just been kind of prioritizing the 956F approval. Hopefully this slide gives you an idea of, if you work with a reputable regional center that knows what they're doing, you should give them a little bit of faith in terms of the 956F, being approved. We have a lot of investors that file their applications before the 956F is approved. I've heard a lot of, chatter about, oh, well, if the 956F is approved before you file, you're going to get a faster approval rate. Sam, could you go back one slide? That's just not true. I mean, you're looking at almost 700 data points of approvals, and I'm willing to bet that there's like 20 to 30% of these investors, especially in the last 2 years, that have all filed before the 956F was approved. So we have investors who file before the 956F approval. We have investors who file after the 956F approval, and then the timelines have remained very, very consistent regardless. So my advice to investors is going to be, listen, stop listening to just phony kind of myths that are peddled by people who are trying to sell you a project. Understand the data. We have enough of it that you can really use it to your advantage. And the only reason you choose a project should not be the fact that it has a 956F approval. You should be choosing a project because it meets your immigration priorities and you feel that it has a very good chance of returning your capital. And the 956F is certainly part of that decision, but it should not be the determining factor.
Perfect. Thanks, Ahmed. All right. So before we wrap up today, we'll spend a couple minutes talking about some of our available rural and urban projects. Ahmed, do you want to start and kind of walk us through the rural projects, and then Mike, you want to talk about the urban projects next?
Sure can. So currently we've got a few different rural projects that are available. We actually just had Bay Creek approved last week for its 956F, big news. And as Mike kind of mentioned, we had the floodgates kind of open, and a lot of investors that were considering it then actually signed up, and we're at this point fully subscribed. But we are working on possibly, investors definitely change their minds, and we are possibly going to be able to expand that offering in the future. So stay tuned for that. But it's a great project with a senior loan. Investors are secured with a senior mortgage on a property that already has close to 300 lots already sold and under ownership. Country Club already active on site with over 550 active members. And this project really hits a lot of things that we look for in a deal, especially on the rural side where it's under construction actively. It's got a senior mortgage in place and a lot of proof of concept of the development itself. We move over to Rocky River. This is with the Coulter Group, a developer that we've worked with for over a decade. We've had an enormous amount of success from an EB-5 standpoint, from an immigration side of things, as well as on the financial side of things. They've repaid 4 projects in total, or 4 funds in total. And yeah, this project features a lot of the same characteristics that prior Coulter projects have with us, where you've got a repayment guarantee coming from a Coulter parent company with hundreds of millions of dollars of assets to back up that guarantee. A big job creation number, so a huge cushion for investors. And at this point, the proof of concept is kind of a no-brainer. It's one of 14 other branded adult communities that are already being developed by Coulter, many of which are well under construction, more than halfway sold, and doing extremely well. And then finally, we have our Grand Park project. This is probably our newest EB-5 offering in the rural space, a 4+1+1 loan term, so investors can expect a 5 to 5.5 year kind of timeline at the worst to get their money back. Again, another loan that's secured by a senior mortgage and 100% equity pledge from the developer. For those who have followed us long enough to remember our Tamarack project, which sold 200 units in about 8 months, one of our fastest selling projects, this Grand Park project mirrors a lot of what investors loved about that project as well. Already great job creation underway. We've got a lot of EB-5 jobs coming up in the near future, and hundreds of millions of dollars worth of real estate already developed and sold in the area as well. So a lot to love for all 3 of these deals. I think that you can see that we structure our deals very conservatively. We're focused on making sure that investors get their money back, and the projects and their structure and the approval that we get for them reflect a lot of that.
Absolutely perfect. Thanks, Ahmed. And for Grand Park, that one does not have the 956F approved yet. Unlike Bay Creek is approved, Rocky River, the prior fund, is approved, but we anticipate it coming in the very near future. So what I've actually been telling investors is get your attorney kicked off now, because that will also very likely sell extremely quickly once it's approved. So be prepared if the approval is something critical. And then one of our big philosophies is just that it's not one size fits all for projects. In the old world of EB-5, there was really one style of deal that worked well, and everybody kind of followed the same template. There weren't all these different avenues. But now what we've done is we've worked to structure deals differently. So the first major distinction is that rural versus the high unemployment urban TEA. So we have 3 of those high unemployment deals. 2 of them are the traditional loan style EB-5 deal, secured loan with lots of different pieces of collateral. But then some investors also are looking for a bit of a return. And in the high unemployment deals, it's a little bit easier to find good equity projects that we can invest in on the equity side of the capital stack. And we've done that with our Terracea multifamily deal that actually has a 5% annual preferred return. All 3 of our urban deals are pre-approved, so they're all 956F approved. And the other distinguishing thing in our urban projects is we're able to find ones that have a shorter investment duration. There's just a lot more good deals to choose from. So we can find ones that are starting construction with a short investment timeline, such as a multifamily deal with an under 2-year construction period and under a year to stabilize before there's a potential exit. So we've done that with the Terracea project. So even though we know there's a long pending backlog coming for the high unemployment, especially for those from China and from India, many investors have still chosen these because with the ability to adjust status, some of the aspects of the project are more appealing in terms of the shorter duration. So just overall, we try and keep a large menu of different styles of deals, all with different pros and cons, and we'll be very upfront with all of those and just help an investor have options to be able to choose what the best fit is for their EB-5 project for what their top priorities are in selecting that deal.
Exactly. And as Ahmed was kind of mentioning earlier, the best fit for an investor is really going to depend on the unique factors and situation, right? For an Indian investor in the US versus abroad, Chinese investor, living in Europe, it's going to be a different answer based on country of birth and place of residence, family or not, kids applying to college soon or not. There's a number of different advantages for particular projects given location and country of birth. So we try to have a variety of options available that kind of fit, depending on the individual circumstances of an investor. And before we wrap up, I just wanted to quickly highlight a couple of our most popular blog posts and videos. One on the left here, key factors to avoid losing money in an EB-5 investment. Unfortunately, EB-5 projects in general are complicated. You're combining a securities offering for a financial investment as well as an immigration application all together. And it can be a little bit overwhelming for investors, who haven't made a significant real estate investment like this or gone through the immigration process, to this extent in the United States before. And so we've just tried to kind of simplify that decision-making process into 4 major buckets and, try to make it a little bit more digestible for investors who, aren't as familiar with this type of an investment or immigration process. And then on the right, this kind of highlights some of the transparency focus that we have as a company of just, getting information on the project, reviewing financials, getting answers in writing, looking at conflicts of interest that need to be disclosed under the RIA rules, hiring an independent attorney, reviewing all the documents that are part of the application, what's happening in terms of future quarterly update reports on the progress of the project after you've made an investment, and getting documents, showing that your funds were, correctly moved from escrow into the project through the NCE. So these are 2 popular posts that I think are really critical for investors as they kind of start exploring EB-5 to take a look at. And with that, I think we're out of time for today. But for investors who do watch this webinar in the future, we've got the QR code here in our website as well. This week was a little bit crazy. I think we had more calls this week than ever in the history of the company. Just given the recent Trump announcements combined with our Bay Creek project getting approved and then selling out in less than a week. But I think we still have a couple of slots available at the end of this week on Friday afternoon, and then we'll have more spaces available next week as well. And I've got the WhatsApp number on there too. Ahmed, anything to add quickly before we wrap up, or Mike?
No, I think this was great. Thanks everyone who attended, and hopefully this provided a lot of context about the data that was just released by USCIS, what it all means, and what the outlook for EB-5 is. And I would definitely say, if you're new to EB-5, go through our YouTube channel. We've got a lot of great materials. We've done a lot of webinars over the last couple of years explaining a lot of really relevant topics for investors. If you're just starting out, or even if you're well-versed in EB-5 at this point, I think we've got a lot of material out there that you can digest. So thanks so much for attending, and hopefully this was helpful.